Hello and welcome. My name is Nishan and welcome to another exciting episode of ESG in Space. I'm
And
delighted to be
hi,
joined by my co-host, Mickey.
hi, I'm Mickey Sode. Thanks again for joining us.
And we're excited. This is a truly international collaboration for today's podcast, crossing oceans from Japan to California and to the UK and London. So let's welcome our guest today. We're delighted to welcome James Cemmell. James has been a friend and collaborator who we've known for many years. He spent 15 years at Inmarsat, one of the largest satellite companies based in the UK, focused on the maritime sector, but doing a lot of other great pieces of work, focused on social impact. And James has been in the space sector for 17 years, heading government relations for Inmarsat for the last 7 years, and has overseen a lot of changes in the sector. The consolidation of the sector has focused on the use of satellites for social benefits, particularly in emerging markets, and has worked on space sustainability for the last few years. So, James, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Lovely to see you again, Nishan, Mickey.
Fantastic. James, maybe we'll just start right in. As you know, we're focused on space sustainability, but the space industry, the space sector, you've seen a lot in the last 17 years. And we're on the cusp of many interesting turning points. What excites you the most about the space industry?
The space industry has become fundamentally unpredictable, and that's exciting. So, when I first joined the space sector, the industry hadn't really changed for many years beforehand. I think if you took a straw poll of leading experts in the space sector at that point and say, what is the space economy going to look like in 20 years? They could have very, very confidently told you something that would have been very, very wrong, but they would have been confident about it. I think now, if you project forward 10 years in space, you can't say who are going to be the top 5 biggest companies. You can't say what the major applications are going to be. You can't say how the industry is going to consolidate, roll up. You can't say what the future of the in-orbit economy is going to look like, and the convergence between the pharmaceutical industry and the space industry and the telecom sector and the satellite communication sector. So to my mind, it's that fundamental unknowability that makes the sector very exciting.
Interesting, because right now, so although there are those unknown unknowns, one of the clear trends has been the move away from government-led space exploration into the private sector. You have a couple of leviathans out there like SpaceX in the US right now, a lot of other emergent startups, different business models from different parts of the world. But the private space industry predominantly dominated in the US, but Inmarsat obviously being an interesting counterexample of a large European-based company. But the private sector is going to play a very different role in the next era of the space economy. And when the private sector runs an area or enters a field, as we've seen in the maritime domain, for example, or the poles, the North and South poles, different mechanisms are needed. Do you think this is an industry or an economy or a stage that needs to have a free-for-all, very libertarian, Wild West approach to let 1,000 flowers bloom? Or are there parts of the space infrastructure or the space biosphere, if you like, that require some sort of coordination? There's a little bit of scarcity that needs to be managed in order to ensure the sustainability of this domain for future generation of businesses.
Yeah, so I think the rumors of the death of government are greatly exaggerated, to quote the famous writer, paraphrase the famous writer. There is still a substantial role in government, though you're absolutely right. The private sector contributions, the role of private capital, the innovation that comes from the private sector, so acting in response to market signals and seeking product market fit, absent a command and control steer from government, is absolutely there and proliferating, even into areas like private space stations, which I think a few decades ago would have been almost unthinkable. But now it just feels like the very natural fit, and you start to see it in government policies. One of the big challenges on coordination is, if you take Starlink, for example. So Starlink, great success, obviously had a tremendous amount of government sponsorship and funding, and benefited from legacy R&D into it, but took a lot of private activity and capital into the story as well. So Starlink's got a very impressive constellation. The satellites whiz around; they never bang into each other. They provide a service at a very high quality within just a few years of launch. It's extraordinary, what they've managed to achieve. Having said that, what's going to happen when you start to have mega constellations coming, which are not Starlink, from other parts of the world? They're going to need to find a way to coordinate, to interoperate. So if you look at the older space sector, this problem was addressed in the geostationary arc, 36,000 kilometers away. Something called the Space Data Association was set up between the companies. So the individual satellite operators, which were Inmarsat, SES, Eutelsat, Intelsat, you can list them off, would need to know where each other's satellites were. They would need to have information, not just about where they were, but where they were likely to move, and not just where they were likely to move, but also the error in position as well. So data that was really going to be proprietary. But it was necessary to share and exchange this information to make sure that you had a collision-free environment and you can move safely. And we need to replicate that at the in the LEO orbits. It's very complicated in LEO. Within the geostationary orbit, you had a fixed number of operators from a limited number of countries. If you look now at the space economy, if you count all the countries who have got a satellite in space, if you look at the OECD data, back in the end of 2020, in 2023, it was 96. So you've now got many, many more countries who have got a foothold in space. Now, not all of these are countries with the level of sophistication of what we call tier one space powers, US or China, with very advanced capabilities like India, Japan, or the European Union. Very often, these are countries with maybe just a handful of satellites that they use for national missions, for Earth observation purposes, to do, for example, disaster monitoring in their territory, to police their maritime waters, to support with agricultural planning, just to do almost nuts and bolts routine activities which are essential to the proper functioning of the state and its security. So we've now got to find a way where we've got all of these different players running all of these different system architectures in a space commons, which is now increasingly crowded. And maybe just to put a little definition on that, at the start of the century, we're having about 100 pieces of metal going up into space, launches. We're now at thousands. We're now at thousands, and 2/3 of those satellites plus are in 2/3 of the active satellites are in the orbital altitude between about 500 and 600 kilometers from the Earth. So they're pretty tightly packed in. That doesn't leave a great deal of room for error. And I really liked your use of the word coordination, because solving for coordination really is the exam question. There was a great piece of work that was done by a UK body just a few months ago called the Regulatory Horizons Council, and they did a study on futures in space. And the team that wrote it were excellent. I'm a big fan of the work, and it was really just imagining space futures. And they really defined it well. They said, we've got to figure out what sort of future do we want in space. Do we want a space which is maximally exploited, where everybody who's got a new idea more or less can get access to space to try out their new idea, to do the innovations, to advance the space economy and the benefits that we get? Or are we going to have a more frosty environment where countries don't trust each other, where you have to leave large safety margins, where we're underutilizing space? We're at a lower equilibrium. We've got to figure out which one of those futures that we want, and then try and make it.
That's intriguing. Yes. So I have a question, especially as you led the government affairs for Inmarsat and founded the ISAT Connection Program, which is a consortium to have impact on people in Kenya and Nigeria and other places. and I think it's pretty relevant for our conversation in bringing different players, right? Especially international players and commercial and governmental, like they all have different agendas. But in order to bring people together to form a consortium or work towards a shared mission, from your perspective, what are some challenges in gathering those people with different agenda together? Can you share some insights from your experience?
Yes. Well, I mean, you're a classic what they call boundary spanner, which is gold dust, and that's and that sort of skill is you can't overstate the value of it. So when I first joined Inmarsat, I was very keen to start figuring out what we could do to use the satellite communications, the connectivity that existed to improve welfare in remote and fragile regions, given that it was remote infrastructure. There was, there were not going to be the operational deployments that you would have if you were going into fragile state areas in Somalia, at that point southern Sudan, and northeastern Nigeria, where Boko Haram were, as part of their MO, were destroying terrestrial communications. They were just blowing up base stations, and then they were going in. So space and resilience seemed that it could have some obvious benefits, particularly for remote and peripheralized populations. The challenge, though, was that space was full of people who liked space and knew about space and could speak to other space people. They weren't able to really talk to other people outside of that community. So the challenge that we had to do was to try and figure out how we could span those different communities. So we did some work in Philippines on disaster response, and there was enough sort of knowledge on both sides, because the Philippines government was actually quite knowledgeable about satellites and space sectors. They knew how to use them in disaster response. So it was fair to bring those people to the table. We could keep the satellite engineers in the background designing the systems. We could have the people who could work with the Filipino government to show, okay, here's actually how you deploy this system here. You know what you need it for. And what they needed it for were setting up instant communications for incident control centers during when you might have a big typhoon or an earthquake, volcanic eruption, or something like that. The hospital, in one of the instances, would turn into an incident management center. They needed to have their own communications. They needed to send people out into the field to triage, to identify the displaced populations. We didn't need to know about that, but we needed to have enough people in the middle who could say, okay, this is kind of what you need to be able to do to be able to conduct your humanitarian operations, and here's what the technology, but not to mix up those two communities. So not to try and be too cute and to become an expert in humanitarian operations, and also not to overcomplicate the technology story.
Interesting. So in that, there's perhaps a lot of examples of use cases that we may not have anticipated going through, right? And so this is kind of this serendipitous connections that you mentioned. How do you bring some interesting folks together? And I think that's inherent in any sort of regulation or coordination. We have this unknown in terms of this sector, space frontiers that we're moving into. How do you think about kind of what should be coordinated? Because if you start to say, well, let's look at whether it's bandwidth, and is it a group like the ITU? I know we talked about previously. Is it orbital spans? Is it the UN body? Is it ownership or exploitation of the lunar surface, or the Artemis Accords? And there's parameters. But how do you think about what should be coordinated, or does there need to be something which is a lot more fluid, to allow for innovation, to react rapidly to what the need is for coordination, and the level of detail through which coordination needs to take place to allow for this sort of innovation?
Yeah, it's a phenomenally challenging area, and you're absolutely right. It's a multivariate function, and it's a nonlinear multivariate function with some chaotic tendencies as well. It's horrible. It's horrible. So one of the terms, the sort of the fudge factor terms that people talk about, is carrying capacity. and carrying capacity, more or less, what sort of, how much can you put where in what sort of operating modes, so that you've got you've got a reduced chance of having collisions, so that you're maximally able to access radio spectrum and innovation, and so that if there is a collision, the chance of that cascading and reducing the exponential growth of debris time, is managed appropriately. So you say carrying capacity is very important, and you move on, because defining it's really hard. There's some great work which is being done, in the US. There's Richard Linares and his group at MIT. They're doing some really rigorous work. Aerospace Corporation as well. In fact, interestingly, the King of England set up something called the ESSI, the Earth and Space Sustainability Initiative, which has got a whole cast of characters who's looking at this problem as well. The OECD has done some really good work on the economics of space sustainability to try and get under the skin of all of that. But effectively, what we're trying to solve for is carrying capacity. Now, carrying capacity will have some solutions, some of which will just be like hard. So it's, it will be radio spectrum, that will be ITU, that will be national states when they give their licensing. The collision environment, if that starts to become a story of radio spectrum and orbital management, potentially the ITU could play a greater role there. But we also have always had in space systems of systems. So PNT, position, navigation, timing, GPS, Galileo, etc., lends itself very well to a system of systems, where the systems themselves, the system operators, get together and they figure out how they can build resilience by having smaller, maybe regional positioning systems, supporting and adding additional granularity to GPS. In Europe, there's a similar system, an overlay network as well. So there's lots of opportunities for coordination between the individual operators of services, but there does need to be some sort of leadership. If you look, for example, at Earth observation, a lot of these countries that have got small missions, sort of taking pictures, etc., wouldn't it be wonderful if they could contribute that data into a bigger system, and if they could then benefit in turn from having access to data that other countries are taking that they don't necessarily have any particular use for? It's not obvious that needs to be government led. That could be led by a private initiative who's just entrepreneurial enough.
Interesting. So I'm wondering, like you talked about how space is becoming somewhat unpredictable, and in a sense that, let's say, US had been a strong power in space economy and industry too, but then more and more other players come in, again, government as well as private companies, but also Europeans or Asians, right? Or UK, Japan, Singapore, India, China, even, right? So in that kind of situation, and also again because you've been in government affairs and international collaboration and all, what are some ways that those emerging countries and private sector players have, what kind of role do they have in forming a future of space economy?
It's a really good question, and it's it's quite deep as well. One of the conclusions that we drew in the 2022 Space Sustainability Report, that piece of work that I led, but with many experts, really sort of doing a lot of the heavy lifting on it, on space sustainability, which we launched to coincide with the Secure World Foundation event in London. But there, we talked about plurilateral diplomacy. We talked about countries that are interested in space sustainability, perhaps because they have to protect their national systems and they can't do it alone, getting together. But also, if you look at the US needs a sustainable space commons if it wants to have leadership, and that's bipartisan in the US. It's even there, implied and explicit in Project 2025. But I think one of the interesting innovations that people aren't really talking about, they're starting to a little bit, is the EU space law. And to my mind, that's super interesting. I mean, and the open question there is, will it be the Brussels effect? Will it be GDPR, the AI Act, the Digital Markets Act? Will the EU, when it comes out with its space law, probably mid-year next year, which will cover sustainability, will cover space safety, and will cover resilience of the systems to things such as cyber attacks? Can you continue to operate and control your spacecraft during adversity? Using the European market size, will that just de facto say, look, you all got to have your systems set up in a way that you can meet these standards, or you just don't get access to the European market? That's certainly the intent. Will that just change the game and create the new de facto standard globally? I think that's a really important question, and it matters if it works, and it matters if it doesn't work.
That's a fascinating analogy. Fascinating because, whether it's the Brussels effect, we've looked at that with AI regulation and the debates on both sides of the pond. In Silicon Valley said, well, is that right to regulate when it's too early? And the European Union saying, actually, no, we have a large enough market. So it is interesting. But also, you've painted two scenarios. One is, does there need to be this global coordination, scenario one, right, where all the players, emergent and incumbents, private and public, come together in some sort of body, like the regulation of the internet, ICANN, or these sorts of bodies, and have the right public-private? Or is this a more agile model, which is that we are large enough to be an anchor body, whether it's the US in itself or the EU, sets a series of laws and precedent, and because they're such an important purchaser of services, or influencer for various reasons, they can shape that coordination, that collaboration. That's an interesting dichotomy of what that future could look like.
I mean, there's a lot of space for entrepreneurialism in space governance, and you've enumerated a few. You've looked at the ICANN type model. There's the GSMA model on roaming, which has just worked amazingly and pretty much perfectly, though there's regulation around all of that as well. But what that's done in terms of telecommunications access globally is just amazing. I've mentioned the King of England's initiative, the ESSI initiative. If we stay slightly sort of UK antiquarian, the outgoing Lord Mayor of London, Michael Manelli, who's actually a space guy by background, created the Space Protection Initiative, which was it was an insurance-led private sector approach to space governance, and it was really interesting how he used his office to start to have discussions about that globally, and people at the margins of the G20 and G7, we're talking about it. So there's a lot of room for entrepreneurialism there, and some of the emerging space economies sectors, space-based solar power, for example, will demand that we address some really, really complicated issues. Space-based solar power, you put massive solar panels up in space, you're a little bit nearer to the sun, you haven't got clouds in the way, you then convert that into a radio signal, beam it down to Earth, and then power your grid with it. Great. But to do that, you've got to solve in-orbit assembly problems, the same sorts of problems that you'll need if you're going to have a lunar and a Mars economy, actually. So it's kind of on the critical path. It's an idea that couldn't have been realized before, though the technology idea has been around since the 70s. It was actually proven. So there's all sorts of fascinating areas, but again, that will require regulation, coordination, and then you get complexities of energy regulation.
Right. But it's to your point, there has to be that framework to allow innovation, or for the crazy ideas to come in first, which may seem like a science fiction or magic to begin with, to quote Arthur Clarke. But then for it to become feasible, to experiment, test out on a small scale, and then see how it should be scaled up. You also raise an interesting point, in addition to kind of the solar kind of phenomenon in space, of the role of certain system actors like insurance, because there may be certain actors that, if it's just the space industry, we wouldn't think about, but insurance and other stakeholders in the finance sector, the TFCD, the Task Force on Climate Disclosures, and some of these interesting bodies on regulating climate, there may be some of these system players that could come in and really affect how we think about risk in that space economy. And especially if we see 90% of the space economy going forward being developed by the private sector, and needing different coordination mechanisms, different pricing mechanisms, different risk mechanisms, and the need to access insurance, because if something goes wrong, it can be very expensive and go very badly wrong, not just for a very narrow set of the market, but a large sector. And so that is fascinating. Really think about the stakeholders in parallel to thinking about what areas need to be regulated as well, or regulated or governed or coordinated.
Yeah, I mean, the insurance sector, personally, I've always really valued the contacts that I've had in the insurance sector, because they know everything. they have to know everything, and they have to know it to 4 decimal places. So I've always valued that, because they're just a great source of intelligence and knowledge and insight. And as you say, they drive good behaviors. So they would like to see, and this goes into the financing and the role of bringing in institutional investors, and what makes a good space investment. They want to see companies that are in control of their fate, that have got good systems, good processes, are able to control the missions. Things do go wrong in space. So you've got to have high quality management, good program management, mission control. It's not the sexiest side of the space sector, but ultimately there's a difference. That's what makes it work. So the insurance industry, of course, has got a lot of incentive to drive those sorts of behaviors. And there's in fact actually a services economy setting up of companies who are saying, we can help you as a new company trying to get into space to look and act professional, which might help you raise insurance. But ultimately, what we're trying to achieve is cooperative, collaborative behavior to get to a sort of a maximal exploitation equilibrium here. That way, you increase the TAM, the total addressable market in space. That way, individual institutional investors can look at space and say, look, we understand what's going on here. It's an orderly environment. There's rules of the world. There's a certain amount of predictability. There's a big TAM that we can play into. There's orderly development of subverticals. And I do think the insurance industry plays, I think, perhaps a slightly unsung but very important catalytic role.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, it's this is an interesting industry. It's not about bravado, although there's a lot of science fiction books, movies, popular culture that talks about the bravado. But your point about it is actually it's very important to have that risk management in place, because very quickly the downside risk could be high and needs to be priced in, especially as the cost of accessing space starts to get lower and lower, in the same way that I guess other individuals have talked about AI like being like fire, very powerful, but uncontrolled in the wrong hands could lead to a lot of risk. Go ahead, sorry, Nikki.
Yes. So I was thinking, of course, it's space economy, right? And inherently, we have to think about capitals and return of investment and all of that, because it's business is a business. But at the same time, I think satellite technology, having a sustainable access to space assets and the benefit from those assets here on Earth and everyday life is also important stories that we have to tell, right? So can you share some of your favorite story where your effort resulted in something like making a real impact in everyday life of people here on Earth?
Yeah, I mean, it's it sort of just makes me think. In the UK at the moment, there's lots of conversation about government budgets being very very much under pressure. And when you talk about space, it's very easy to be summarily dismissed. That's a luxury. It's an extravagance. That's not something that we've got. The country is utterly dependent on space for all the right reasons. It tracks the essential climate variables. You have the weather forecasting. You have grid management. You have I mean, on a formal basis, it's even described as critical national infrastructure. So when you take space away, the sorts of things that happens when you lose access to critical national infrastructure go away. And so one specific example, work that we did in Indonesia on illegal, unregulated, unreported fisheries, we realized that a lot of fishing vessels were going out on their missions, sometimes for weeks at a time, with very, very limited communications capabilities, sometimes even none. And through some work that we did there a couple of years ago, in fact, just before COVID, we had several hundred vessels in our study. We had some examples where a couple of them lost power tens or hundreds of kilometers from shore. One instance, there'd been a collision with an LNG tanker. They just lost power. And these people would have been lost at sea with no communication system, without access to satellite communications to be able to call for help and to be rescued. In the same study, we had a fisher who had a stroke on board the vessel, and without satellite communications wouldn't have been able to call to be airlifted. And with strokes, time is everything. The disaster response work that we did in the Philippines, we when we went out into the field and we met with the first responders, they would tell us that there were rumors circulating in the field that they were able to squash because they were able to understand what was going on, provide timely information, so that in a time when people are very distressed, in a very disorderly environment in the aftermath of a disaster, they were able to make sure that people had the right medicine, knew to trust it, had good and timely information. And again, in disasters, time to response is the single determinant of the ultimate economic and human cost.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yes, James, I feel that we could talk all day about these fascinating kind of high impact work. I mean, it's clear some of the work you've done has been incredibly impactful, have been life-saving. It's clear that the space economy and the space industry is critical to all life on Earth, whether it's on these acute emergency situations or in climate change or long-term management of the planet. It's a key capability that we need. Some of your points you've mentioned on our space futures, our space commons has been really important, particularly the role of risk. That's a unique perspective that we've heard from you that we perhaps haven't heard from others. And being in London, the home of the finance industry, and where a lot of insurance companies are based, it does give a very unique perspective, which we haven't heard from other sectors. And also being in a middle power, whether it's the UK or the EU, that is between the other space giants. That's a really important position, and that Brussels effect could be a very powerful effect. James, we've run out of time for this particular podcast, but I just want to thank you for your insights, for your time, and for joining us on our podcast today. So thank you, and hope to see you in future podcasts as well.
Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure. And Nishan, I've appreciated the work that you've done over the years, particularly on the maritime domain, which has been really important. And Mickey, your work is absolutely fascinating and really at the frontier.
Oh, thank you, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.